In the previous lesson, we saw how we can change a state in the Redux store by dispatching actions. At times, when an action is dispatched, we may want to intercept that action before it reaches the reducer and either change it or cause some side effect to happen, something other than changing the application state. For example, we might want to write a message to a log file, or we might want to make a server request and wait for the server to respond. This is where Redux Middleware can help. Redux Middleware provides the capability to run code after an action is dispatched and before it reaches the reducer. So, Middleware provides a point where you can inject third-party extensions that can respond to an action. One straightforward example is Redux Logger. Let's look at an example of how the Redux Logger library works. Once you install it and add it to your React app, in the console, it will by default show a log of every single action that's dispatched. As you see, the log shows the application state prior to the action being applied, then the contents of the action object, then the new state after the reducer has applied the action. You can see how this logger could be very useful in debugging. You will learn how to install Redux Logger in the next exercise. Redux Middleware is also used to help you deal with asynchronous calls. You've not dealt with asynchronous code very much at this point in your bootcamp, so let's briefly discuss what that means. With synchronous code, whenever something is executed, the application waits until it's finished before continuing. This means nothing ever happens out of order by mistake. But this can be very slow. What if every time you try to, for example, copy a bunch of files from one folder to another in your computer, and the whole computer froze and you couldn't do anything else until the copy operation was finished? Frustrating, right? That's what synchronous code is like. Asynchronous code, on the other hand, will let you start something, then continue on with your program without having to wait for it to finish. You can keep going with the rest of your code, and the result of the asynchronous call will be dealt with later. A very common asynchronous call is when your client-side code requests data from the server. This data is not available right away. The request has to go over the internet, then the server has to respond, and while typically this is very quick, there's still a small delay while that happens. So if you request the data and then try to use the data right away, you may encounter an error because that data isn't available yet. We haven't accounted for this yet in the way that we've implemented the data loading in our app thus far, and it hasn't mattered because we haven't been making any server requests. We've just been grabbing the data locally. This won't work in the real world. So how do we have an action request data from a server, then wait for and handle the server response? This is where Redux Middleware can help us. The middleware will wrap around the action dispatch, then insert code to deal with the asynchronous operation before passing the action forward. Aside from logging and making async calls, there are many other uses for middleware, such as crash reporting, stopping an action from reaching the reducer under certain conditions, dispatching other actions, and so on. You can also chain middleware so that you can run multiple third-party extension libraries in sequence. The way that you will insert Redux middleware is via the apply middleware function, which is passed as a parameter to the create store function. You will see the use of this in the next lesson. Redux Thunk is one of the most useful Redux middleware libraries. The term Thunk is a programming technique where you wrap a function inside another function, allowing you to delay its execution until it's needed. This technique comes in very handy with Redux because it lets you inject extra operations into an action creator. Normally, an action creator has one job: to create and return an action object. Let's look at the official definition of Redux Thunk from its documentation, and I want you to focus on the first couple of lines. Redux Thunk middleware allows you to write action creators that return a function instead of an action. The Thunk can be used to delay the dispatch of an action, or to dispatch only if a certain condition is met, or even to dispatch multiple actions. So normally, the way that Redux is set up, the action creator function is expected to return an object which is sent directly to the reducer. Redux Thunk enables you to use that action creator to delay, stop, or change that dispatch. This will hopefully make more sense once you're using it. In our project, what we'll do is use Redux Thunk to have an action creator function generate an asynchronous request to a server for data, then dispatch a new action depending on the response to that request once it's received. Redux Thunk is the most common way to handle the setup of simple asynchronous logic in Redux action creators. There are other ways, such as Redux Saga, which is a more advanced library suitable for handling complex asynchronous logic. We will not go into Redux Saga in this course, but when you've mastered Redux Thunk, it's worth considering learning Saga as well. Redux Observable is another library similar to Saga, and there are others. But for the purposes of this course's project, Redux Thunk will be more than enough to handle our needs. In the next lesson, you will begin to use Redux Thunk and Redux Logger in your project.